Good morning, everyone. This is Ruth Wilson. I am the Director of Employee Support Services. We also have Mary Letch on the line. She's the Assistant Director of Employee Support Services. And what we do is, in our department, is offer advice and counsel regarding university policies and procedures. We also work in problem-solving employee issues and dispute resolution. We are here as a resource for supervisory as well as non-supervisory employees. Today, we're going to talk about the Fair Labor Standards Act. We're going to talk about our timekeeping policies, and we're going to talk about updates that are going to occur to the staff handbook. I know that some of you may have questions about Kronos. This session is not to talk about Kronos. I would like to mention that there are frequently asked questions available on the Workforce Management website for those people that have questions about Kronos. And invitations are also being sent out to invite timekeepers to attend a training session to learn more about Kronos. So again, today's presentation is Timekeeping Policies of Tulane and how those relate to the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, establishes standards for minimum wage, overtime pay, record keeping, and child labor. The FLSA affects more than 130 million workers, both full-time and part-time, in the private and public sectors. Tulane, as with other employers, is required to comply with this federal law. And here at Workforce Management, the compensation group is the group that mainly uses the FLSA in evaluating how they do employment classifications for faculty and staff positions. The next slide talks about that employment classification. And all jobs are categorized by an employment classification as determined by the FLSA. These classifications are based on the actual job duties in each job description. So what happens is the compensation group uses those guidelines to determine whether a position is exempt or non-exempt during the creation as well as reclassification of positions here at Tulane. So you should know that each of your jobs has already been classified as exempt or non-exempt by the compensation group. If you're exempt, it means that your job is not eligible to be paid overtime. As such, you only are required to record exceptions to your work. And those exceptions would be when you use sick time, vacation, you have jury duty, or you take time off for bereavement. So any time essentially that you're not at work. If you're a non-exempt employee, it means that you are eligible to be paid overtime, and as such, you have to record your actual hours worked. So you're required to record those actual hours worked, and in addition, of course, absences would need to be recorded as well. Moving forward in the presentation, we are going to primarily focus on non-exempt employees unless we note otherwise. The next slide talks about hours worked. Non-exempt employees must be paid for all hours worked. Hours worked includes any time that the employee is required to be on the employer's premises, on duty, or at a prescribed workplace. Reporting to work early, working through lunch, or staying late must be paid to non-exempt employees. Those activities, however, must have prior supervisory approval, so it's not the employee's discretion to come to work early, work through lunch, or stay late. That has to be managed by the supervisor, and employees that deviate from that may be subject to disciplinary action. The first question came in, and the question is, as a non-exempt employee, can I volunteer to work longer than my regular hours? Can I track extra hours worked off the books? And the answer to that question is you cannot volunteer to work off the clock for hours for work that you are paid for, so you have to record all of those hours on your timesheet. When we talk about overtime, non-exempt employees scheduled to work 37.5 hours per work week are paid overtime for hours worked over 37.5. Some departments, however, are scheduled to work 40 hours per work week, and those departments are paid overtime for hours worked over 40. Departments that are on a 40-hour work week have gone through a pre-approval process that includes their senior officer and workforce management. So it's not that the supervisor's discretion to just randomly set the work week to 40 from 37.5. A question came in: does FLSA require notice to or consent from employees when scheduling overtime? The answer to that question is that the FLSA does not require notice. It's not required to have consent. However, we do advise managers that they schedule that in advance to the extent that it's possible. So we understand that sometimes emergencies come up, and of course the employees should try to be as flexible as possible, but sometimes it's not possible and employees are required to work overtime. Speaking more about overtime, the next slide talks about the work week. And Tulane's work week is Friday through Thursday for non-exempt employees. And overtime is calculated based on the work week, not the pay period. To help you understand the difference between the work week and the pay period, we have the biweekly payroll calendar, and that's found on the Workforce Management website. It's a visual tool to help understand where the work week starts and ends, and then where the pay periods are. And that's really important for managing overtime. So I'll give you an example of the work week and how it works with overtime. If an employee works an extra hour on Friday, Monday, and Tuesday, and regular hours on Wednesday and Thursday, that employee would be paid 3 hours of overtime. Of course, that's because they worked extra on Friday, Monday, and Tuesday. Part-time employees are paid overtime for hours worked over 37.5 hours per work week. So an example would be if a part-time employee is scheduled to work 20 hours per work week and works 25 hours in that work week, that employee would be not eligible to be paid overtime because they haven't worked the 37.5 hours in that work week. Again, overtime must be approved in advance by the supervisor, and if overtime is worked but not approved, we still have to pay. However, the employee may be subject to disciplinary action. The next slide is about compensatory time or comp time, and that is when an employee works overtime in the work week and is allowed to take time off in another work week to avoid paying overtime. Comp time is not allowed at Tulane. An example would be if a non-exempt employee works 45 hours in a work week, the employee must be compensated for all hours worked in that work week. Allowing the employee to take time off in another work week would be considered comp time and is not permitted. Actual hours worked, of course, must be recorded accurately as well. And so an example would be if a non-exempt employee works Monday through Friday, 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m., and that employee comes in on Saturday to check on an experiment and works for 1 hour, that employee would need to record the hour on their timesheet and be paid for that hour. Failure to record actual hours worked, absences, or reporting time for another employee is not allowed and is subject to disciplinary action. We have a question. The question is, as a non-exempt employee, can my supervisor adjust my schedule within a work week to avoid or minimize overtime payments? And so again, the question is, can the supervisor adjust the schedule? And the answer to that is yes, within the work week. They can adjust the schedule within the work week. The question came in, has comp time ever been allowed at Tulane? And the answer to that is the law has changed. So yes, at one time comp time was permissible and it was within the law, and it isn't any longer. And so now comp time is not allowed. Another question is, if an employee works an hour over one day, can they leave an hour early in the same work week? And we just answered that question. So again, that would be something that the employee would need to work out with the supervisor. And if the supervisor is okay with it, and that would again depend on what's going on in the department, then it's completely permissible for the employee to leave an hour early before the end of the work week. But again, that would be up to the supervisor, and they would need to work that out with the employee. The next slide talks about lunches and breaks. Supervisors may allow a 15-minute paid rest period during each half day of work. And the way that usually works is, of course, 15 minutes in the morning, then the lunch, and then after that 15 minutes. Employees must be relieved of all duties during meal periods and breaks. Breaks may not be used to compensate for arriving late, leaving early, or to lengthen a meal period, and may not be accumulated if unused. Breaks also may not be taken during the first or last hour of any shift. So employees that use more time than permitted for breaks or who take excessive breaks may be subject to disciplinary action. And again, that goes back to the standard of, all employees are required to maintain a good attendance record. And of course, that includes coming to work on time and adhering to the work schedule. A question came in, are employees entitled to be paid for lunch if they eat lunch at their desks? And the answer to that is if the employee is working while they're eating lunch at their desks, then that employee must be paid for that time. So yes, if they're working, they need to be paid. Now, the question always comes in, how can you tell if they're working or not? So again, you would need to schedule that in advance. And we don't advise managers to require their employees to eat at their desks and work. And of course, that happens from time to time. Otherwise, it's a better idea to have the employee take lunch in the break room or in a different location than their desks. The next slide talks about tardiness. Employees are expected to be in the work area and ready to work at the beginning of scheduled hours. Any time after start time is considered tardy. However, departments may allow a grace period, and that grace period depends on the needs of the business. Employees who are excessively tardy, again, may be subject to disciplinary action. Work schedules. The university core working hours are 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m., although some departments' schedules may differ based again on the needs of the business. Some departments work evenings, weekends, and holidays. Tulane does allow flex time, and flex time is when a non-exempt employee is approved by their supervisor, senior vice president, and workforce management to work outside the core working hours. Now, requests for flex time must be submitted and approved in writing, and we often get questions about flex time. And flex time is usually a longer term arrangement outside of the core working schedule. So an example of if somebody needed to adjust their schedule 1 week because daycare was closing early, let's just say on a Thursday, then the supervisor has the discretion to work with that employee during that week. Of course, that's an exception, and that's not something that would happen every week or every month. And so the supervisor does have that discretion. However, if it's a longer term situation that needs to occur, for example, let's just say someone's taking a class or the supervisor needs someone to come in and answer phones starting at 8 o'clock in the morning, then that would require a longer term arrangement and is, again, something that would need to be approved by their senior vice president and workforce management. The next slide talks about vacation. Exempt employees may use vacation in whole or half-day increments. Non-exempt employees may use vacation in less than 1 hour increments. You may not use a vacation before it's accrued, and that typically refers to the introductory employee. And of course, during your introductory period, you still have to go through that and complete 6 consecutive months of employment before you end your introductory period, and then at that point you'd be eligible to take vacation hours. Okay, so what is the process for obtaining flex time approval? Again, that would be, let's just say at the department level, the supervisor would discuss that with, say, their department head or chair. and then the department head or chair would send a request, and that request would involve the reason for the longer term adjustment, and then they would send that to their senior vice president, and then the senior vice president signs off and they'd forward that over to workforce management. So it's a process that would occur in writing, and emails are certainly okay for that process. The next slide talks about travel pay for non-exempt employees. Home to work refers to your commute, and your commute is not paid. A lot of times we get the question here about the shuttle, and the answer to whether the shuttle is covered, and that is part of your commute. So the time that you're in the shuttle getting to work, that is part of your normal commute, and that's not paid. Home to work for special assignments is time spent traveling to an off-site location, and that is paid only to the extent that the time is beyond what you would normally spend commuting to and from work. So an example is, if you're required to attend a seminar in Baton Rouge, and it takes you 1 hour and 30 minutes to get there, and your normal commute is 1 hour, you would be compensated for the 30 minutes of that commute. Travel as part of the day's work is compensated. An example would be if you're traveling from your office to a meeting that's taking place in Kenner, you would be compensated for that drive to Kenner. Occasionally, a non-exempt employee may be required to attend a seminar out of town, which would require overnight travel. Overnight travel is compensated for the time that overlaps your regularly scheduled work shift. So I'll give an example of that. If an employee works normally 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. and the employee leaves to go to a seminar on Sunday at 4 p.m. and arrives at 9 p.m., the employee would be compensated for 1 hour of travel time, and that's from 4 to 5 p.m. Lunch breaks are, while you're traveling, it's the same as if you were at work. Lunch breaks are not paid while traveling. The next slide talks about the updates to the staff handbook. These updates are anticipated to take effect on August of this year. The first talks about pay for emergency closings. Non-exempt employees that are required to work during an official emergency closing of the university, and again, just a reminder, only the president of the university can determine if it officially closes. So if that happens and a non-exempt employee is required to work, that employee will be compensated for 2.5 times the regular rate for all hours worked during the emergency closing. So before the pay was dependent on the number of hours worked, whether it was within your schedule or outside your schedule. Now it's 2.5 times your regular rate. On-call pay is when an employee is scheduled to stand by and be available to respond to an emergency when off. And so now we've standardized the on-call rate, and so that's what the change is. Callback pay is when an employee that was on call is actually called back to work. And the change there is that now there is a guaranteed 3-hour minimum on callbacks. So if you get called back, it's a 3-hour minimum. On-call pay and callback pay must be approved in advance by the workforce management organization. We do have a question about the overnight travel. I'm going to repeat the overnight travel example. Okay, so if the employee is normally scheduled from 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. and the employee leaves to go to a seminar on Sunday at 4 p.m. and arrives at 9 p.m., the employee would be compensated for 1 hour of travel time, and that's from the 4 to 5 p.m. because 4 to 5 p.m. overlaps their normal schedule. This concludes our presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to call us at 504-865-5280, or you can email us at wfmo@tulane.edu. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.